Hello, this is Dr. Gary Rose, and this lecture introduces the behavioral analytic perspective on substance use disorders. First, let's go back to the public health model of disease. Substance use problems and addiction can be understood with reference to the agent, the host, and the environment. With regard to the agent, the intoxicant, one needs to understand pharmacokinetics, how a drug moves through the body, and pharmacodynamics, how the drug impacts the neurotransmitter systems and other systems of the body. Host issues reference the human that uses the intoxicant. Included here are attitudes and expectancies regarding intoxicant use, decision-making processes, this particular human's journey through life, which might or might not have included developing a sensitized brain. Environmental factors take us outside of the substance and outside of the human's body. Here, one focuses on patterns of alcohol and drug use that exist within a context of sociopolitics, community norms, and access and availability of drugs and non-drug reinforcers. The most astute substance abuse theorists and practitioners seek to integrate these three different perspectives. With this in mind, in this lecture, we will turn from the molecular perspectives of agent and host to the molar perspective of behavioral economics. Molecular versus molar perspectives. Most of this course to date has focused on molecular theories of substance abuse and addiction, models of addiction that focus on the elemental aspects of drug pharmacology, implicit and explicit learning, and neurocognitive processes. With behavioral economics, we turn to a molar theory of substance misuse. Molecular theories seek explanations that are found at the lowest levels of abstraction. Molar theories seek big picture explanations at the highest levels of abstraction. Molecular and molar may also be defined as the micro and the macro perspective, respectively. The molar perspective. In 1990, psychologist Rudy Vucinic and associates authored an American psychologist paper entitled The Molar Perspective on Drug Abuse. 10 years later, Vucinic wrote another American psychologist article entitled, to paraphrase, Why Nobody Read the First Paper. Behavioral economics, the conjoining of microeconomics with reinforcement theory, has been on the fringes of addiction psychology for 30 years, standing as a refreshingly astute approach to understanding the use and abuse of intoxicants. Although slow to adoption, behavioral economics is currently in the mainstream of addictions theory and research, with hundreds of papers published on delay discounting, the behavioral economic theory of decision-making and choice. We will discuss delay discounting later in this lecture and more thoroughly in class. You won't find what you're looking for in there. Molar theories assert that one will never find sufficient explanations of substance use decision-making and behavior simply by looking inside the body, employing agent and/or host explanations. One must put host and agent explanations into the larger molar context of access and availability of drug and non-drug reinforcers and direct and indirect costs associated with decisions to use or to not use intoxicants. From a molar perspective, the molecular theories fall short because they fail to understand that neuropharmacological, cognitive, and decision-making processes always occur in the larger context of sociopolitics, economics, norms, and expectations. Here's an excellent example of the molar perspective, the Music Man. In this famous diatribe, the Music Man identifies a problem, the pool hall. The kids are turning down their knickers and hanging out at the pool hall. Where's this going to lead? To smoking, hanging out with quote unquote loose women, swearing in church, etc. The pool hall is the gateway to a life of depravity and degradation. Is the Music Man wrong? Interestingly, we know that the best predictor of intimate partner violence, for example, is the number of retail alcohol outlets in a neighborhood. What's the solution to this systemic problem of depravity, alcoholism, and dropping your knickers to your ankles? Is the answer to close down the pool hall? Shut it down, board it up? Nope. Another one will open a block away. The solution is a brass band. How does a brass band solve the pool hall to drinking to degradation problem? It offers the kids a non-pool drug, tobacco, sex alternative positive reinforcer that competes in a decision-making manner with going to the pool hall. One must now either go to the pool hall or march with the band. The bright, shiny brass instruments and over-the-top uniforms serve as powerful positive alternative reinforcers. The cost of hanging out at the pool hall becomes high. It is both the cost of admission and the opportunity cost of not being able to march in the band. This is a classic Molar behavioral economic problem and solution.
76 trombones led the big parade, with 110 cornets close at hand. They were followed by rows and rows of the finest virtuosos, the cream of every famous band. 76 trombones caught the morning sun, with 110 cornets right behind. There were more than 1,000 reeds springing up like weeds. There were horns of every shape and kind. There were copper-bottom timpani and horse platoons.
In way of introduction of behavioral economics, here's a brief overview. Emphasizing the manner in which contextual factors, including socio-political, economic, and cultural variables, determine the onset and maintenance of addictive disorders, behavioral economics directs our attention to the interplay of drug rewards and alternative non-drug rewards in determining the addictive liability of a given pattern of drug use. Even with a drug as neuropharmacologically potent as cocaine, the reinforcement value, or addictive liability, is not a constant, but an ever-changing function of the context within which the drug use occurs. All things being equal, those with many alternative positive reinforcers, such as job, money, family, social support, long-term core value-related goals, will be less vulnerable to the addictive effects of substance misuse. Understanding the APR profile of your client is key. A second observation of behavioral economics is that drug use follows the same laws of supply and demand as does any other consumatory behavior. As with many other commodities, most drugs of abuse demonstrate mixed elasticity. They are responsive to increases in cost, but only above a certain level called the P max. Legal policies such as the legalization of cannabis should be informed by studies of complementarity and substitutability, with the latter predicting that increased access to weed will decrease use of more harmful or costly drugs. Cost, by the way, is not simply the direct cost of the drug, but also includes opportunity cost, what one must give up to be able to do drugs. It also includes effort, lost self-esteem, lost esteem of others, and any other tangible or intangible cost. These are all components of the total cost of consuming drugs. From a behavioral economic perspective, one is not focused on predicting and understanding one incidence of drug use. Rather, the goal is to understand the big picture of patterns of drug and alcohol use over time. Molar variables of interest are one's access and availability of drugs, as well as access and availability to non-drug reinforcers, and the extent to which the latter is contingent upon not doing the former. One can look at stress as a relapse trigger for substance use from both the molecular and the molar perspectives. From the molecular perspective, one focuses on the manner in which stress may prime drug craving in the midbrain dopamine system or activate cognitive schemata, both of which may result in urges to use. The molar perspective is very different, however, as the focus is on the manner in which stressful life circumstances decrease access and availability of non-drug positive reinforcers. An example of the latter is the phenomenon of late life onset of substance abuse. The micro perspective focuses on changes in cognitive and neurophysiological processing as a function of aging. The molar perspective focuses on the manner in which retirement, loss of a spouse, and decreased mobility, for example, decrease access and availability of tangible and social non-drug reinforcers, leaving fewer reward options other than a fine single malt whiskey. In this lecture, I will introduce many of the basic concepts of behavioral economics. In class, we will integrate these with motivational interviewing. We start with APRs, alternative positive reinforcers. A fundamental behavioral economic construct is the alternative positive reinforcer. In the context of drug use decision-making, the APRs are the activities one can engage in, including the purchases that can be made, that are options at the same time as one is choosing to engage in drug use behavior. At any one point in time, each of us has a finite set of activities to engage in, of ways to invest our time, money, energy, etc. When one chooses to do A, one also chooses to not do B, C, D, or E. If A is to engage in substance use, then B, C, D, etc. stand as alternative non-drug reinforcers. To the extent that these are powerfully positive and numerous, then the opportunity cost of doing A is high. The opportunity cost is great. If I get high, I can't go bowling, go on a date, work on my doc project, or have tea with the queen. Of course, individuals differ in terms of their access to powerful and numerous APRs. And this differentially stands from a behavioral economic perspective as a cogent factor with regard to vulnerability to the development and maintenance of a substance abuse problem. To the extent that one does not have access to alternative, highly valued non-drug APRs, one is much more vulnerable to deciding and committing to substance use. As with the Music Man, one can design powerful drug treatment interventions that manipulate APRs. One such program was the Midnight Basketball Leagues of the 1980s and 90s. Inner city high school gyms were kept open all night to allow kids to play basketball and to hang out. The only quote-unquote cost of entry was that you had to not be stinking drunk or intoxicated. These programs were defunded during the Bush presidency because the Republicans believed that the Midnight Basketball Leagues were simply ways to coddle drug addicts. However, from a behavioral economic perspective, The leagues were a direct and targeted intervention to reduce drug use. By offering a highly valued non-drug APR that directly competed with drug use, the Midnight Basketball Leagues increased the total cost of drug use to the point that the positive value was low relative to the positive value of going to the gym. This is behavioral economics in action. As it says in the scriptures, thou must giveth if thou taketh away. Be careful when you propose, threaten, or otherwise undermine one's access to valued positive reinforcers. The items that show up in the pros of staying the same quadrant of the decisional matrix, for example. One will necessarily gravitate back to the high-risk positive reinforcers, including drug use, unless equally valued alternative reinforcers are available to fill the void. We discussed this phenomenon with respect to the elevated reward threshold of the transmitter rebound withdrawal phase observed during nicotine and cocaine abstinence. That neurobehaviorally mediated process is an example of the Molar construct of APRs. Hi-ya! It's always valuable to identify a client's APRs, both as part of the engaging process and also in the service of understanding the dynamics of decision-making. Here are some helpful open questions for an APR inquiry. What did you do for fun before you got involved with alcohol and drugs? Tell me about the good old days before drinking and drugging became a problem. Tell me about the good old days before your health was compromised by hypertension. What would you do instead? If you gave up smoking weed, what would you do instead? What would you do with the time? These are all ways of identifying these APR diamonds in the rough. Now the behavioral economic plot thickens. Not only does the behavioral economist focus on the array of APRs available to an individual, but they also observe that this array is constantly changing. Furthermore, the BE theorist asserts that the reinforcement value of a given activity is constantly changing as a function of these alternatives. The value of a commodity, of an activity, of a choice is not constant nor even stable. Reinforcement value is a function of context. The theory of choice. Psychologist Richard Herrnstein first articulated this principle in the theory of choice and its associated matching law. People make choices based on the assessed value of each possible choice. The value of the choices are a function of what else is available at this moment in time, and also what else is anticipated to be available in the future. Here is a little basic algebra that codifies the theory of choice. The rate at which I choose to do B1, behavior 1, versus other activities is a function of the reinforcement value of behavior 1, R1 in this calculus, relative to the reinforcement value of the alternative activities. Given that we are dealing with ratios, the relative value of any one activity will change as a function of all other available activities, with a consequent change in frequency of doing that activity. Reinforcement value is not constant, even when we are talking about drugs that hijack the motivational center of the midbrain. Here's an example. During the Soviet era, and perhaps now, the rate of alcohol use in Russia was through the roof. Why was this the case? Was it a function of the devastation to the soul of Marxism? The collective apathy of the proletariat? Actually, no. If you went into a Soviet-era general store, you would have found a bunch of rotten vegetables, some second-rate ersatz sauerkraut from East Germany, and little else except for 50 varieties of Russian vodka. Why did the Soviet citizens purchase and drink so much vodka? Because there was little else to spend their rubles on. The value of the value of the vodka was high, not because everybody was addicted to vodka, rather because in the molar context of APRs at that time, vodka took on exceedingly high value. Methamphetamine in the Heartland. Same thing in the US Heartland. Once you've tipped a cow a few times or driven 120 miles per hour down a 50-mile straight section of interstate, very boring, the fun abates. Meth, on the other hand, always provides a predictable midbrain DA wallop. Rate of meth use goes up in the context of few alternative positive reinforcers. Ditto with fentanyl in northern Maine. Not much else to do up there. IV drug use and consequent overdoses is greatest in the US communities with the fewest economic opportunities. No jobs, no money, no way to pursue a calling in life. In the molar context, in that molar context, opioids have exceedingly high relative reinforcement value. Studio 54.
Was the first club that you could really look upon as defining a particular decade or era. In the 60s it was the Beatles, in the 70s it was Studio 54.
I like it because it's really the nightclub of the future. It's a kind of culmination of a sort of nightclub that's been arriving gradually for the last 10 years.
I like the atmosphere of Studio 54. I've been to a lot of discotheques and I don't like them.
What's the difference?
All around the world I've been, I don't know, the feeling. I mean, the excitement of the props coming down and the balcony. It's just exciting, honestly.
When you hear the name Studio 54, what is...
It was the first club that you could really...
Studio 54. A number of frequenters talked about how they were using cocaine, quote, before it became addicting at Studio 54. Before it became addicting. What does this mean? Were they simply in denial? Or were they somehow protected from the addictive effects of cocaine because they had so many alternative positive reinforcers? Did their access to highly valued APRs somehow protect them from the midbrain addictive liability of powdered cocaine? The most likely explanation is this APR explanation, given that the agent cocaine is pretty much the same for everybody. One could do a thought experiment in this regard regarding cocaine. Run an experiment. Two groups of teenagers, one group from Wellesley and the other from Chelsea, Mass. Dose each group of teens with the exact same quality and frequency of cocaine. Come back in a month and assess each kid for evidence of drug dependency. What do you find? You find a much higher rate of dependency among the Chelsea kids. Why? Similar brains, same drugs, same neurophysiological processes. The difference is in the access to APRs. What are the Wellesley kids doing when they are not snorting lines? Tennis, dance class, yoga, etc. What are the Chelsea kids doing? Not much else. Even cocaine, a substance with marked reinforcement value at the level of midbrain neurophysiological processes, has a reinforcement value that varies as a function of the molar context of opportunities and choice. The reinforcement value of a drug as powerfully addicting as cocaine, nonetheless, still varies as a function of the molar context of drug and non-drug APRs. Summarizing the theory of choice, effective interventions from a theory of choice perspective increase the individual's access to alternative non-drug reinforcers that have particularly strong value, are core value related for this particular individual, thus increasing the opportunity cost of choosing intoxicants. The most powerful APRs are core value and identity related activities that compete directly with regard to allocation of time, money, and effort with drug use. More about this later in the lecture. A second powerful construct in behavioral economics is the classic microeconomic law of demand. As old as the hills, this law asserts that there is an inverse relationship between cost and consumption. Price goes up and demand goes down. For ages, it has been asserted that drug use, otherwise known as addiction, does not conform to the law of demand. The addicted brain supposedly craves drugs no matter how much time, effort, and money is involved. In actuality, drug use choices conform to the law of demand the same way that do all other consumer choices. People and rats decrease their rate of choosing cocaine as the price goes up. For rats, the price is the number of lever presses it takes to get an infusion of cocaine. Same thing with heroin purchasing. Of course, these observations are anathema with the micro theories of craving level addiction, both opponent and proponent. Even the incentive sensitized brain functions in a molar behavioral economic context. Behavioral economics normalizes substance misuse. Rather than standing as an aberration, as a set of behaviors that fundamentally diverge from all other types of human choice, BE emphasizes that substance use decision-making follows the basic human principles of reasoning, commitment, and intention in action. What about the craving level of addiction, wherein the core motivational processes are implicit and non-cognitively mediated? Even here, there is a molar element with the matching law running as a turnkey background process. However, for the sensitized brain, the R1 reinforcement value is so high, it takes very powerful non-drug APRs to reduce the incidence of drug use. This is why contingent social rewards in cocaine treatment are so essential, for example. There are subcomponents of the law of demand that are critically important with regard to the BE model of substance abuse. One is elasticity of demand. Elasticity of demand, a highly intuitive construct, refers to the sensitivity of a consumer choice to changes in price, price being direct plus indirect cost. Commodities may be elastic, meaning they are highly sensitive to price changes, inelastic, meaning that purchase choice patterns remain stable even as price increases, or they may demonstrate mixed elasticity. Think of some everyday purchases that are highly elastic, where as price goes up, you stop buying or doing X and substitute instead buying or doing Y. Perhaps instead of going to the high-end vegan restaurant anymore due to a spike in the price of tofu, you opt instead for a veggie pizza. Or maybe your brand of beer changes from the top to the bottom shelf as a function of a spike in the price of hops. Elasticity is not simply a function of changes in the commodity price. Cost can be relative. One takes a pay cut, for example, and decides to bring coffee from home versus going to Starbucks for a quad skinny latte, for example. The latte price is unchanged. However, the cost of the latte relative to one's total income has gone up. How about inelastic commodities? Purchases that remain constant even as price goes up. These are often the staples of life: milk, bread, eggs, toilet paper, facial masks, Lysol, heating oil and gas, electricity, internet fees, and Netflix. Netflix prices, by the way, have just jumped up. Why was Joe Kennedy's fuel assistance program for the impoverished so important? Why does Bernie hawk for universal health care? Because these commodities and services are, or at least should be, inelastic. Mixed elasticity. Mixed elasticity refers to the situation wherein a choice is relatively inelastic until a certain price point, above which the choice becomes elastic or sensitive to further price increases. Many commodities or choices demonstrate mixed elasticity, including drug use decision-making. For example, think of gasoline, pre-pandemic when people actually drove to work. What is the price point at which driving behavior changes? At what price does the typical coastal American change their habits? For example, start carpooling or trade in the F-150 truck for a gas-sipping sedan. The price is around $4.25 a gallon. Below that price point, people maintain their behavior patterns and accommodate to price increases by allocating increased resources to the product. In BE terms, $4.25 is the P-max for gasoline, the price point at which the commodity becomes elastic. College tuition also demonstrates mixed elasticity with a very high P-max. Look at your tuition bills. Study these two graphs. Below the P-max, demand, choice among purchases, etc., remains stable, and the cost of that behavior goes up. Above the P-max, demand drops and cost stabilizes or drops. Think of the rat pressing the lever in the Skinner box for puffs of a cigarette. The cost is the number of presses needed to receive a puff. The rat presses that lever like there's no tomorrow until the unit price hits 1,000. Then the rat reconciles itself to fewer puffs. It just ain't worth it anymore. Intoxicants and drugs of misuse generally demonstrate the properties of mixed elasticity, just like gasoline, tofu, and relationship maintenance. P-max, one hell of a construct. For example, think of the P-max of a given relationship, the point at which you are simply working too hard to justify the effort. Also, think about how that P-max shifts as a function of context, of, for example, how many APR relationships are out there. Tobacco e-cigarettes demonstrate mixed elasticity, particularly for young people, because they have fewer resources to draw from. Once the price reaches P-max, demand reduces now, and the population incidence of nicotine dependence decreases down the road. However, this only works if and when the price reaches P-max. Below the P-max point, tobacco use is inelastic, which means that the nicotine user is expending increased resources for the same dose of nicotine without changing consumer behavior. What does this look like with respect to illicit drugs? What does below P-max drug use look like? it looks like increased crime, sex work, and stealing grandma's television. Another cool BE construct is substitutability, very important given the scriptural assertion, thou must giveth if thou taketh away. Commodities have relationships to each other. Some complement each other, meaning that as the demand for one goes up, so does the demand for the other. Some are substitutes with the obverse relationship, yet other commodities and behaviors are simply independent of each other with respect to demand and implementation. Donuts and coffee are rumored to be complementary commodities. Steak and hamburger are likely substitutes. As the price of ribeye goes up, people opt for a juicy burger instead. Knowing the relationship between commodities is important with respect to both the engineering of APR availability and with respect to understanding the manner in which commodity A may or may not trigger demand for commodity B. Review these figures. On the left, we observe that heroin and Valium are substitutes. As the price of heroin goes up, heroin demand goes down and Valium demand goes up. This is your steak-hamburger relationship and suggests that offering Valium to the abstinent heroin user might mitigate urges to relapse at the level of matching law, not due to pharmacological effects of the benzodiazepine. The middle graph depicts the lack of a demand relationship. Heroin demand remains stable even as Valium cost goes up, and Valium demand accordingly drops. On the right, one sees complementarity. As alcohol choices decrease due to cost increase, so does cigarette choices and demand. This complementarity curve is the reason that addictionologists have recommended that nicotine-dependent people who are trying to reduce their alcohol intake also reduce their nicotine intake at the same time, versus the opposing one addiction at a time. Due to the complementarity, doing this initiates a recursive process wherein decreased demand for one results in decreased demand for the other, so forth and so on. Mojo legalization. So, what about cannabis as a substitute for harder drugs? Is there a reverse gateway between heroin and cannabis, for example? Anecdotal reports suggest yes. However, the data are still unclear about the substitutability of one commodity for another. We just don't know yet. A billboard on Route 93 Boston, circa 2018. Let's now look at demand in the context of supply. The law of demand asserts that as supply goes up, cost rises, again, both indirect and direct costs, and demand subsequently goes down. Supply goes down, cost rises, demand goes down consequently. Of course, having addressed elasticity, we know that this is moderated by the degree of elasticity, and especially mixed elasticity of the commodity. So one must always consider the Pmax when thinking about the relationship of supply and demand. Let's consider the US war on drugs from a behavioral economic point of view. The war on drugs is essentially a supply-side intervention, focusing on increasing cost by reducing supply. Supply-side interventions like this only moderate use when the cost goes above the Pmax, which is often not the case. The war on drugs has failed to complement supply-side interventions with demand-side interventions. These latter include the stimulation of APRs, norms modification to decrease expectancies regarding drug use, treatment that provides access to non-drug APRs, etc. Supply-side interventions without demand-side interventions not only do not solve the drug problem, but create secondary problems. These include increased crime consequent to the higher cost of drug purchases, and increased number of drug dealers. Drugs in limited supply command higher profit margins for their distributors. Drug dealing becomes better business, a better business when supply wanes. Opioid overdoses. As with other efforts to mitigate the public health impact of drug abuse, U.S. efforts have principally been focused on the supply side of the problem. Drug interdiction, changes in MD prescription patterns, etc., reduce availability, increasing cost, and hypothetically decreasing demand. Of course, this last effect, decreasing demand, only occurs if the cost increases above the Pmax. Were one to offer a more balanced supply side and demand side set of interventions, what would that look like? Take a moment and think about some demand side interventions. Interventions geared towards decreasing the demand or desire of drugs. What APRs would have to be present to induce these kinds of changes? What skills or capacities would the drug using individual need to be able to achieve, access, or implement these APRs? What might some of these APRs be, and what would somebody have to be able to do to access them? Here are some supply side and some demand side interventions. The red items are to some extent being implemented, although we have miles to go with regard to offering bottom-up, comprehensive, high credibility, i.e. makes sense to the client, low opportunity cost interventions. Look how skewed the current policies are towards the supply side of the equation. When you get a moment, take some time and consider these behavioral economic principles and how they might inform you about how to effectively engage and promote change in your health behavior clients. In particular, engage in this thought experiment when you have a moment. Creating reinforcement-rich environments. Opportunity cost is a cogent factor in moving from preparation into action. What are some of the opportunity costs that your clients face? How can one increase the opportunity costs of high-risk behaviors and also decrease the opportunity costs of engaging in treatment and change? Opportunity cost. Going on a tangent for a moment, given that the opportunity cost of using your blinkers is so low, it's just a flick of a finger, why do so many Massachusetts drivers refuse to signal a turn? Are they truly committed to discourtesy and increasing the probability of rear-end accidents? Or do they just really enjoy noticing through the rearview mirror the gnashing of teeth in the driver that follows? A final thought experiment regarding substitutability. Harkening back to the decisional matrix, what does the matrix say about the need for substitutions for the high-risk behaviors? What might be some substitutes for a particular client, starting from their perspective as opposed to yours? We will discuss the New Roads exercise in the context of behavioral self-control therapy and how it targets these questions. But again, we find that the information available in the decisional matrix is just golden. And in this regard, with respect to identifying the unique needs and reinforcement values of staying the same, of drinking and drugging, and what one would have to have in place as non-drug APRs with respect to attending to providing for and satiating these same sets of needs and desires. The old model of like, need, and crave. Here we have social, political, and neurobehavioral contributors of the evolution of a drug problem from like to need to crave. Each of these 6 factors facilitates the development of a drug use disorder. No one category has primacy with regard to the quote-unquote gold standard explanation of drug addiction. They are all of equal value. Social stigmatization and marginalization, loss of access to APRs, political supply reduction without demand reduction, high opportunity cost treatments, neurobehavioral, the neurobiology of incentive sensitization and midbrain sensitization, the psychology, reinforcement psychology of burning in of choices, of intense habit strength, of turnkey habits and behaviors, etc. They are all of equal value. Notice how the social and political categories are populated by behavioral economic constructs and foci. What is drug misuse? From the macro perspective of behavioral economics, what then is the true nature of drug misuse and addiction? From a behavioral economic point of view, drug abuse is a highly stigmatized example of everyday behavior, a highly stigmatized version of grandma's chicken soup, so to speak. It's initially cheap entertainment, often chosen when alternatives are bleak, when non-drug APRs are limited, particularly risky because of incentive salience and incentive sensitization and the manner in which the hijacking of the midbrain dopamine system leads to the imputing of exceedingly high reinforcement value for the associated drug, and must be handled gently by those most vulnerable, those somas and soma-like individuals who have the neurocognitive dysregulation problems that increase their vulnerability to severe enduring substance use and misuse. The hottest topic in behavioral economics, the one that has generated hundreds and hundreds of research papers in the last 10 years, is delay discounting and intertemporal choice. It's a very, very cool, non-personality-based way of understanding the concept of impulsivity. From an intertemporal choice perspective, decision-making is addressed with regard to, quote, I could do this now, or do or have this other thing later. The famous marshmallow experiment was an early example of an investigation of temporal choice and the consequences thereof. We will talk about intertemporal choice and delay discounting in our class lecture. I simply want to whet your appetite about this topic in the next couple of slides. The key constructs of intertemporal choice: smaller short-term rewards, often immediate, larger long-term rewards, always delayed, and the rate at which one discounts the value of the LLRs. Individuals differ in the discounting of delayed LLR rewards, and this discounting rate is highly predictive of the initiation, continuation, and failure to successfully resolve a substance abuse problem. Reinforcer pathology, a concept purported by Warren Bickel, has the potential to organize and unify research across the various and disparate arms of addiction science. See, for example, a paper by Strickland and Lacey, 2020. Wimpy is a guy who Bickel would call an example of reinforcer pathology.
I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today.
And this ends our introductory lecture on behavioral economics.